Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the workshop on public engagement with science and philosophy of science, hosted by the University of Cincinnati's Center for Public Engagement with Science. My name is Lucas Dunlap. I'm a visiting assistant professor in philosophy here at UC and an affiliate of the center. And I'm really happy today to be chairing this session on informal STEM education with our distinguished panel. So let me introduce our panel here today. First, we have Dr. Rae Ostman. Dr. Ostman is an associate research professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, co-director of the Center for Innovation in Informal STEM Learning, and director of the National Informal STEM Education Network, or NISENet. She has broad experience in planning, developing, implementing, and studying museum exhibits, programs, media, and other learning experiences in partnership with diverse organizations. In her talk, Dr. Ostman illustrates the potential benefits of informal STEM education with examples from research projects conducted out of ASU's Center for Innovation in Informal STEM Learning, among other examples. Second, we have Brian Pollock, who is an informal science educator and science communicator at Cincinnati Museum Center. Since 2005, he has taught science at zoos, camps, and museums to a wide range of audiences. He shares a love of science communications through the Sharing Science Workshop and Practicum at the CMC. In his talk, he discusses this training, which supports academics in translating their research to general audiences. Last but not least, we have Dr. Brenda Hunda, who is the curator of invertebrate paleontology at the Cincinnati Museum Center. Her past research focused on stratophonetic patterns and ontogeny in Flexicalamein trilobita from the Upper Ordovician Cincinnatian series of Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. I had to practice that. She has been the invertebrate paleontologist at CMC since 2004. Her position includes exhibit design, educational programming development, community outreach in the form of lectures and workshops, curating the largest collection of Upper Ordovician fossils in the world, developing a research program, and working with one of the highest diversity fossil sea bottoms in North America. In her talk, Dr. Hunda tackles the issue of STEM identity from several vantages, the 5+1 R's of public engagement with science, working with communities, and what it means to engage other ways of knowing and apply EDGE principles to informal science education. So welcome all three of you. To start off, I'm going to combine two questions from our Slack channel that were both originally directed to Rae Ostman, but I'm going to put a more general version of those questions to all three of you. The first of these two questions that I'm going to combine comes from Joyce Havstad, who said, quote, "Why design educational experiences whose aims are set by researchers and educators and, for instance, intended to associate chemistry with positive attributes such as interest, relevance, and self-efficacy? Is that what people want to learn about chemistry, that it is interesting, relevant, and it can make one feel self-efficacious? More generally, I am wondering why one important set of stakeholders, namely the learners, do not seem to be involved in the part of the process which sets what the learning aims are for these instances of informal education." The second of the two questions comes from Nate Jorgensen, who says, "I failed chemistry in college. If you mention an activity about chemistry, my heart rate goes up and I slowly move to the back of the room. Do these programs take into account the anxiety a much younger participant might be bringing into the room in order to break through that self-doubting wall that needs to come down first?" So the more general point that I see as underlying these two questions is this: how is it that the learners or the visitor to the museums, how are their interests taken into account when designing these activities or exhibits? Do you decide what, in terms of content, it would be best for them to come away understanding about the topic? Are the approaches to the content influenced by what they may be expected to know according to school curriculum? In short, how do the considerations about audience play a role in the development of these activities and experiences? And perhaps, Rae, if you could go first, since these questions were originally aimed at you.
Sure, thank you. And I thought these were both great questions, so I'm excited to start with them and thinking about them together. So to look at it from a more broader point of view, Joyce brought up the question of how are different stakeholders involved in defining the goals of the project. And then Nate's question, and Lucas, your kind of elaboration is how are learners or visitors to museums kind of involved throughout the process? And every project is different, but there are, and I really appreciate sort of noticing, there are lots of different people who are involved and they have different interests and values. And ideally, from my point of view, all of those are taken into account, and we're looking for a place of common interest, recognizing that there's different expertise, there's different sort of values and priorities, but what's our common interest? And so some of those stakeholders are the researcher or the evaluator. Some of them are the community member or the learner. Some of them are practitioners or educators who are kind of sharing these with the public. Some of them are funders who are kind of have a certain stake or a certain goal. And in my own work, I really like to find a place where there is an interesting research question, something to find out, an interesting practice question, how can we do this better and actually have an impact, and then a priority of the community. So the community cares about this and they want to take part in it. And then how are the community members, the learners specifically involved throughout the process? Again, that really depends on the project and it depends on the particular methods, but generally, we like to have all of those sort of participants or stakeholders involved, at least at key moments throughout the process. So early on when you're planning and thinking about what the goals and the priorities are, a little bit later when you're sort of defining it more clearly, like what are the specific objectives maybe that we're trying to learn. Later on, when you've got an idea about how it's working and you're sort of testing and improving and doing that in an iterative way. And then of course, at the end, when you're finally kind of making it happen. Not everyone is involved in every single part, but ideally everybody helps to shape it throughout the entire process.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Brian, do you have any thoughts about audience considerations?
Yeah, I mean, I think for what I do, I think there's a little bit of a distinction between sort of museum floor programming versus exhibit design and how we weight the various stakeholders and those different things. So like an exhibit design, we're looking to attract audience. So we want to make sure that it's something that is catching to the general public. We definitely think about schools also. We want field trips to come to see our exhibits. So we might be looking at different standards for different age groups for those as well. When we're doing programming though, programming is a little bit more fluid and it can change over time. So usually the start of it is something that is just of interest to our staff, that they are excited about something and want to share it, or it relates to an exhibit in a specific way that we want to highlight. But those, when we do the development on programs like that, it's highly iterative. We're sort of piloting things on the museum floor with visitors, seeing what they are interested in and making adjustments to try to really capture engagement as we go. So if something's not working and it's not driving engagement with visitors, so they're just not interested, then we're likely to either change or just drop the program entirely. So I guess that sort of, in a way, it's we're finding what their interest is through trial and error for programming. Exhibit design obviously is a little bit different. Once the exhibit's in place, it's very difficult to change them. So we do have focus groups that come in for that. I know, Brenda, have you worked with focus groups? Yeah. And we also do focus groups for just what are some interests that they might have. So that I hope that answers the question for you.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks very much. And Brenda, any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, certainly at Cincinnati Museum Center, we kind of had a very interesting experience in that we underwent a 2.5-year restoration project that almost virtually emptied out our museum. And we've been in the process of refilling it with exhibits and programming and so forth. So it's provided us a unique opportunity to see what our community wants to actually have in there. So I'd say primarily one of the most important things is community engagement. This is a two-way conversation, not just me as the scientist or the educator deciding what we think is most important, but what are some of the topics that we can present to the community? What does the community want to see in our galleries? What do they want to learn about? So we have a lot of community engagement, community going out to talk to communities about what their specific needs are in terms of whether it might be science or history, what it is that they would like to see, how we can better serve them. And then at every step of the process, we have focus groups, evaluations. We have community members coming to talk about it at the initial conceptual phase, all the way through different design components to the final outcome. So I think for us, really communication with the relevant stakeholders along the entire way is how we can work to do our best to ensure that the people that are coming through our doors to see the experiences have had a voice in how that's been determined. Of course, Ray mentioned we can't talk to everybody all the time. That's true, but our relevant partners work very, very closely with us to help us take the temperature of the community to make that work. And I would speak to, so anxiety, like calculus is my anxiety. Thankfully, we don't put that in any of our content, but I can imagine going to a math exhibit and seeing like nothing but calculus. It just
I'd love to.
Oh yeah, Brian would love to. But I'd have a heart attack. But I think informal learning settings, whether they be museums or zoos or other programs, can work to help create the environments that might help to reduce some of that anxiety and promote the information in fun, creative ways, while we work very closely with schools to make sure that the content meets their needs in terms of standards. We don't have to follow the same rules as the formal education system. And that allows us to be more creative and introduce different tools that might enhance the learning experience, but also maybe reduce some of that anxiety. And I think that would be a benefit of definitely informal learning settings.
Yeah, I would say we also, when we're doing programming about chemistry, it's very rarely the pitch is, hey, come do chemistry. The pitch is normally something about a specific phenomenon or something.
Blow something up.
Yeah. It's instead of referring to the school subject chemistry.
Yeah, come learn about the federal school standards 21.B.2.
Right.
Just not going to work.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This next question kind of expands on the discussion that Brenda and Brian were just having about CMC in particular. It comes from Melissa Jacart, and she asks, Brenda, we know you're a museum curator, and Brian, we know you're a museum educator, but I'm wondering if you can tell those of us who are less familiar with the workings of museums what each of those roles is like and how the features of engaging with audiences are different from each of your perspectives.
Sure. So it used to be that when we thought of curators, we thought of them historically as people who would basically stay in the back of the rooms and work on whatever they were curating, whether it be, in my case, fossil collection or history collection, that they weren't necessarily public persona of a museum. And that has really become sort of in my view, the more antiquated view of what a curator does. Every museum is a little different because they have different teams of people that operate differently. Some curators are purely academic and tenure track. They're just like university professors, except that they do it in a museum, while others like myself are a bit more jack of all trades. I think that I have gone into the museum industry blending two of my favorite loves. One is research and the other is public science outreach and education, and that the museum at Cincinnati affords me those opportunities. So I tend to get my hands involved in a lot of different things, including everything from exhibit design and development, content. So I'm a content person and a specimen person to curation and research.
Yeah, I think Cincinnati Museum Center had a really a unique opportunity when we went through a restoration. Because we were closing down the main building, all of the education staff moved into the research and collection facility. So our offices were shared with the curators. which was really great because prior to that, there wasn't a ton of communication between education and curators, and it really opened up a lot more discussion. So since then, we've had a much more collaborative approach to some of our programming. As a museum educator, I do stick mostly with the program development and exhibit design, sort of content development end of things. But we're working with curators to talk about our content, and we're also working with science partners to come into the museum, because we think it's sort of mutually beneficial to our partners for us to have working scientists in the museum, whether they be our curators, some of whom have labs that are actually like part of museum display now, or if it's outside partners who get to come in and share some research that they're doing. So that is expanded recently since we've come back, and it's been a great opportunity for us.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is for Rae Ostman, and this is about one of the projects that you mentioned, one of the collaborations you mentioned in your talk. This is from Eduardo Martinez, who says, toward the end of your talk, you mentioned a program on science and religion with the goal of having participants share their views and develop understanding of others' view without necessarily aiming at agreement. Do you know of any programs that aim to use this kind of exchange of narratives as a first step in a scaffold process to where participants eventually work on developing answers to questions they share or evaluating justifications for different claims? Whether or not such a program exists, do you have thoughts, given the theoretical framework you use, about how programs can productively build up these forms of collective inquiry? Is this even a worthwhile aim for a program? I'm completely convinced, he says, of the value of sharing personal narratives as an entry point, but I also worry that we cannot fully leverage the value of the improved understanding of others' narratives without further opportunities to productively and systematically reason about better or worse answers or actions in light of shared questions and problems.
Yeah, this is a great question and really perceptive way of kind of thinking through the value of this approach. So I'm excited to talk about this one. So the Science and Religion project was really taking a space that we felt was contested and trying to diffuse that and let people share each other's views, right, without coming at it from a kind of a polarized point of view. We developed a variety of different programs, and some of them did scaffold, as Eduardo mentions, a little bit more than others, and some of them were more open-ended, like let's share and learn. But to the question of, are there projects that have done this in a more kind of robust way? Yes, and one that I wasn't part of, but I really recommend looking into. There's an exhibition called Race that was developed by the American Anthropological Association in partnership with Science Museum in Minnesota. It's a very powerful exhibition, and the programming that was done along with that really involved, and all sorts of community groups took part in this. Police departments came and saw the exhibition and did this programming. So it's incredibly powerful and really important work that was done as part of this. And that programming had a space where each person sort of shared their stories, shared their perspective, and then scaffolded towards, right, like more better understanding among all the participants. And that included both the science of what is race as a social construct and what are its biological basis, and also what is the lived experience of people, right, of different races. And there is an educator guide and other materials that go along with that. And so that would be a great thing to look up and sort of see that approach and how that worked. And then a second project that I'm working on right now is focused on climate futures. And this project is going to do, but hasn't yet done, Eduardo, so maybe you can help with this, is going to sort of take up this challenge that you set forth. And in this particular project, we're taking a set of climate scenarios, of different scenarios depending on what we do today. What is our climate going to be like in the future in central Arizona? And incredibly robust science that has been done kind of for years and years, all sorts of diverse disciplinary input. But one of the pieces that they did was think about, okay, so how would your daily life be different, and sort of spelling that out if we took this path and this is what we did, right? So these different scenarios. What we've done is taken those sort of science-based pieces and developed fictional narratives around them. So like fictional characters in the future. And then that's a starting point for kind of workshops with communities to talk about climate and to talk about what solutions we might take today, right? So that's like another contested kind of topic. What's interesting about the fictional narratives or the fictional stories is then it lets people open up a conversation by talking about the characters and the characters' experiences before they kind of get into their own, having to share their own feelings and kind of feeling like they're arguing with their neighbors, you know what I mean? So that's a nice entry point to think about what would the life be like in the future for these people. And then we're going to try to scaffold to, okay, but what future do we want to see? And what are our values and our priorities in our community? And the reason we're taking this approach is we think it's really important to kind of emphasize that this is an area where we need to take collective action. Sure, we can each take individual actions, but we, as a society, as a community, have to work together. And so by thinking about those stories of what our collective lives will be like in the future and what we want to see, we think that's like a productive way to go. But I'll have to update you on that.
That's great. Thank you. This next question is for Brenda, and it comes from Joyce Hofstad, who is one of the founders of the Extinct blog that you mention in your talk. Joyce says, do you think there is a place for, quote, practicing science in public, distinct from, alongside, in addition to the place of informal science education? I ask because I was surprised to see Extinct featured as a top-down data-driven attempt to conduct informal science education. I don't see the Extinct blog as aimed at educating the public. I see it as an attempt to practice the philosophy of paleontology in public by practitioners for themselves and other nearby practitioners in a way that welcomes but does not aim at wider public participation in education. Regardless, this difference in perception got me wondering, is there a difference between practicing your craft, be it science, philosophy, or what have you, out in the open for the public to see and participate in if they want, and practicing informal science education? To me, it seems like there is a difference here, but I'd like to know if you agree, and whether you think there might be benefits and pitfalls to each, as well as differences in the relative frequency of how often one or the other ought to be featured in different spaces.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm trying to wrap my head around it right now, to be honest with you. So when I was featuring those blogs, it was really as examples of different ways in which paleontology can engage the public and at different levels. And certainly the intent and the target of those blogs has to be taken into consideration. In our case, we do practice paleontology in an informal setting. We do that in a variety of ways. One is that we do that through our on-site paleontology prep lab, which allows the public to see paleontology, particularly paleontology prep in action. And we also, although it doesn't exist at the moment, have in the past taken the public out to participate in their own paleontology digs with the professionals as part of a field experience. And I think that is actually not uncommon in our particular science. And paleontology may very well be uniquely suited in some ways to be able to do these types of opportunities of actual science investigations in the field. I think that there is can you, Lucas, can you give me that last part of that question again, just so I can?
Yeah, so the part that was bolded by the original author as sort of the main question. She says, is there a difference between practicing your craft, right, practicing your science out in the open for the public to see and participate in, perhaps, versus practicing informal science education? That is, I mean, is there some benefit to thinking about them in different ways of engaging with the public, or is it all part of the same spectrum?
Thank you. No, I don't think it's all part of the same thing. I mean, I think there are differences, even in informal science education. When we are teaching, we're still, even with audience participation, we are still presenting material. When you have people able to actually practice, and I do this a lot actually with people coming out in the field with me, doing paleontology, it changes your STEM identity from somebody who's watching somebody else teach or participate into actually them doing it themselves. And I think that helps to reinforce the fact that they can see themselves actively engaging and learning in this process, particularly in paleontology, and that helps to bolster their STEM identity, which of course is really super important, as we know, for when people, children especially, think about future careers. Allowing them to be participatory and have those experiences gives them that personal, intimate connection with science and science process that allows them to see themselves engaging in those activities, ultimately, whether or not they become a scientist themselves. And so I think that that is a distinction, and that is a huge benefit of having participatory experiences.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so I had prepared sort of an expanded version of that question to put to everybody. You did address some of the issues I was interested in discussing there in that, but I said, expanding on that idea, I wonder if Brian or Ray might be interested in saying something about the importance of catering your content to a particular audience. Is it possible to do effective informal STEM education by simply practicing science in public? And I think that Brenda has made a compelling case that it is. It seems to me like there may be very important things that can be communicated in this way. For example, the nature of scientific disagreement is one example that kind of comes to mind. Seeing scientists actually, working through developing consensus. But on the other hand, it might only be motivated, interested members of the public that seek out these forums, like perhaps the Extinct blog as an example, to get this sort of behind the scenes view. So how do these considerations about, whether or not you're catering your content to a particular audience, as a sort of education experience, is that the best or the only way to really do effective informal STEM education? Or is this sort of seeing scientists doing science from behind the scenes, that sort of perspective, also potentially an effective way of doing informal science education? Ray, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So I'm not disagreeing with Brenda, but I'm thinking about it a little bit differently, I think, maybe. And so, or maybe it's just like sort of another facet of it. So when in a university setting, when I'm kind of explaining what I do as an informal STEM educator, and maybe even how that is different from sort of what they might consider doing when they think about sharing their science with the public. What I really like to emphasize is that my work is all focused really around the learner and sort of what the learner is going to get out of the experience. And I think when we're sort of practicing science alongside learners, we're also thinking about doing really good science at the same time. So it's not a either or, it's a sort of a both and situation. But I'd really like to emphasize when I think about what informal education is, it's like really centering, right, the learner. In terms of tailoring the content, actually, I felt like I didn't quite answer Nate's part of the very first question. So maybe I'll return to that a bit. And I know Brian has a ton to say about this because he gave an amazing talk. But one big part of that chemistry project, actually a bigger part of it than the part that I presented on the talk, was really understanding how skilled facilitators do this work, right? Approach learners who are coming from all different places with different experiences, knowledge, values, interests, right? And how they have this amazing skill set to kind of create that experience for each learner. And so the bigger part of the research, actually, that like in terms of what took the most time, was actually investigating how facilitators were able to do that. And then the bigger part of the project, that chemistry project overall, has been sharing those findings about the facilitation with the bigger communities. And there's sort of kind of two primary communities that we're sharing that with. One is informal educators, who include folks who might work in a children's museum and don't specialize in STEM and actually have some of that very same kind of maybe chemistry anxiety. And then chemists who are in school now and going to go on to be educators in all different settings, maybe high school, maybe college. And so really trying to share that knowledge. And it is, I think a really, really big piece of this is actually being able to kind of really listen and be responding to the other person more so maybe than what am I trying to tell you next. And I think that is like one of the biggest skills, actually. But I'd love Brian to say more because I know he's really, really good at it.
So I mean, just thinking back to the original question about sort of the difference that I guess what we accomplish when we have scientists sort of doing their science in the public versus a more informal science education approach. And I think the having the scientists doing their work in the public is really, really valuable, but it does have a much smaller audience that is typically interested. And some of that is participatory too. So, we have a group of volunteers that goes out in the early morning to look for dead birds that have hit windows overnight downtown, and they're actually helping to collect. But that's a really small group that's going to participate in that. And typically they are not scientists themselves. They're usually birders, but they're helping to sort of advance that science. And that sort of community science project that is along with a researcher, I think is a great program, but it is not the broad audience that we seek to work with, like in museum for our informal science education. And so they're sort of accomplishing different goals. Both, I think, very important goals, but they're really hitting different audiences. And when I'm doing programming, I'm much more focused on the participant and how we're going to keep them engaged, rather than getting a scientific finding, for instance. So yeah, very different goal.
I think just as a general question I have, and I'm maybe it's unusual that I get to ask one, but is what do we mean when we're actually talking about practicing science? How do we define that, and what does that look like? Because I could tell you that practicing science from an academic perspective is very different than practicing science from an informal STEM perspective. And I know that it really does depend on your goals and outcomes, and I see many different ways that we practice science, but I mean, the idea of the academic way at which we have to write hypotheses and make predictions and do all the steps is not actually how I practice science academically at all. Now, I know that I have to go through those steps as a scientist, but I'm not sitting there thinking, my hypothesis is this. I'm going to make these specific predictions. Only I do that when I'm grant writing. But when I'm actually out practicing my own science, even as an academic, it's a more granola, it's a more evolving kind of thing. Not to say that it's not within a framework at which I've been taught, but it's something that I think we just need to really think about when we're trying to think about what it means when we practice science. I don't have the exact words for it at the moment, but I don't know a whole lot of scientists that, the scientific method maybe is inherent in us. I'm not sure, but I think that it's not as structured as academia makes it out to be. And so what does that mean for when we actually practice it? And what does that look like in different settings?
And I think so I know one of your big points was about identity. And so when I'm thinking about what I do in the museum, I'm doing a lot of science content with visitors. I don't personally think of myself as a scientist. I think of myself as an educator. But the goal is to try to get the audience to think of themselves as at least capable of doing science, right? Maybe not necessarily identifying as a scientist in the moment. So when I'm talking to kids and they are asking if I'm a scientist, I don't necessarily identify that way, but I want them to think of themselves that way, right? So I'm usually, I don't have a good answer for this one. I definitely don't say I'm a scientist because I think that's disingenuous, but it's a sort of an interesting approach to try to say, like, we're doing scientific things here, but this is different from being a research scientist in a way. And that's definitely a difficult message to share with the public and try to build that identity. So, I mean, I struggle with that. I've been doing this for years now, and I still struggle with that kind of approach of what does it look like to do science versus to sort of represent how science is done, and sort of make that distinction.
Yeah, and I think that I'm a scientist in my view because I do it for a living, right? But I think that we all innately do science every day, and everybody has the ability to do it because we do it every day. We do it all the time. Kids do it all the time, and it's just breaking down the barriers, I think, by what it means to be a quote unquote scientist with a PhD versus your ability to do this, because we live in a science-based world and inherently everything around us has science in it. I think that's an important distinction to make, so that it in some ways it breaks down the barriers to seeing yourself as a scientist if you already know that you're doing science, but you just, maybe you haven't chosen or might not choose it as a career option. You're still doing science.
Yeah, excellent. Very interesting. Thank you for that discussion. This next question that I have is for Brian, and comes from Eduardo Martinez, but it follows right on from these themes that we're discussing. So I'm happy to have anybody weigh in on this who's interested to say something. Eduardo says, you noted that informal science educators need to motivate engagement to facilitate education, and that the amount of energy devoted to motivation varies with audience. This raised a related question for me. Do you have any thoughts about how informal science educators should, or perhaps currently do, promote shifts in interest in their audience such that they move from being motivated by the hook, for example, your example, the tie into a show like The Walking Dead, to being interested in the relevant domain of science itself? That is, what are the strategies for getting people interested in the science content itself after you've sort of reeled them in with the hook?
Yeah, I thought this was an excellent question. And I actually struggled to come up with sort of a one-size-fits-all approach for this, which I think really speaks to some of the challenges that people have when they start entering into informal science education. But I think the number one thing that I think is important is sort of a genuine enthusiasm for the topic. And that seems to be the thing that keeps people along with you, is sharing some of the excitement around discovery and interesting phenomena that you might come across. So I was trying to think of a good example of this. And for me, being in our dinosaur hall it's an automatic hook. There's dinosaur fossils. And people are really interested in it. But one of the things that we kind of focus on in Dino Hall is some of the sort of comparative anatomy that you can do and look at how maybe some more primitive features in some of the older fossils and more advanced features in some of the newer fossils. And so I usually talk to visitors about, we have a large pteranodon hanging from the ceiling, and comparing the wing of the pteranodon to the wing of a chicken, which is also in the exhibit, as chickens are dinosaurs, as are all birds. And talking to visitors about the homology of the bone structures of these animals, trying to relate it that the pteranodon is a pinky flapper. They flap mostly with their pinkies. That's like half the wing, versus looking at, say, a bat down at the cave, which is the whole hand which is flapping. And then using that to sort of shift over, like, okay, let's look at the same structure in this dinosaur and then this bird. It's the same structure, but look how different it is. And we can sort of shift into, oh my gosh, now that I'm looking at homology, right? I mean, I probably haven't used this word at all when I'm talking to visitors, but now that we're looking at homology, look at all of the things that I can discover about these animals just by looking at which bones are shaped differently. And that's academically, when we're talking about it in a setting like this, sounds pretty boring. But visitors get really into it if you have sort of genuine enthusiasm for it. And like, there's an aha moment of discovery of, oh yeah, no, people were I read the thing that said that birds are dinosaurs, but I didn't understand why until I saw this specific bone that's present in both and how it's changed over evolutionary time. And that sort of genuine enthusiasm combined with like this self-discovery, I think, is what really gets people to stay interested after that, after the hook is no longer really the thing that they're looking at.
I think one thing I would add to pick up from what you're saying, Brian, too, is I sometimes like to think about learning that is about a topic and then learning that is for any topic, but also for that topic. And so what I mean is if you get everybody all excited about the chicken bone, that's great. And some people might be really into that particular domain, right? And they want to explore that more. But also, even if honestly, like you do what you say, which I believe you do, you get people excited about learning and that sense of discovery and all of that, you're developing these kind of cross-cutting attitudes or skills that are useful for a whole variety of different domains and topics. So we learn those things like critical thinking or, positive attitudes like interest. We learn them through a topic and then they're useful for a whole variety of different topics. So in some cases, I don't want to say the domain isn't important, but in some cases, even if it's not somebody's, like passion for the rest of their life, the sort of general skills for learning and through learning that they develop are like an incredibly important outcome as well. And that's something that research shows informal learning is really, really good at, right? The sort of the interest, the motivation to learn, and then that development of identity as somebody who can learn, who can think about it, who can maybe study it, who can contribute to it, right? And that's where informal learning is best. And if you really want like a deep dive into a content area, into the practices and processes there, then formal education is the sort of complementary system for that in our society.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So there were many, many interesting questions on the Slack channel, but it's time to move on to taking some questions from the Zoom chat. That Slack channel, by the way, is stable. So that's going to persist past the end of this workshop. So you can return to that, anybody, and take a look at the questions that were asked there, and perhaps we'll get some answers there too. But moving on to the questions from the Zoom chat. This first one comes from Sarah Reynolds. And she says, I wondered if the speakers might be able to talk more about how engagement is analyzed and evaluated in informal science education. How should we gauge or measure engagement? Is that even productive, or should we look at something more like impact? Does this change our understanding of what it means to be engaged with something, or of what the value of engagement really is when it comes to learning or discovery in science?
Yeah, so I think the sort of evaluation on engagement, there's a number of things that the actual metrics like engagement time, for instance. Museum programming is interesting because it's very at will. People come and go as they please. So if someone sticks around for 20 minutes at a museum program, I mean, that is incredibly long and that is huge engagement. So sometimes we just look at engagement time for how long they're going to stick around. Sometimes the evaluation piece is really difficult in the museum because people don't really want to answer surveys or hang out with us for very long. That's always a big challenge. But yeah, I think the sort of general sense of, are people sticking around a long time? Are they asking insightful questions? Sometimes it's a little bit more of a feeling from an educator, someone who's been doing it for a while, who maybe is very skilled at it, can gauge this. It sounds pretty wishy-washy. We don't have good hard data to go with on that, but I think that's usually where I'm coming from. Is are they staying? Do they want to learn more? Are they asking lots of questions and especially insightful questions? There's definitely a different quality to the type of interaction, the type of questions that we get back from an audience.
We have another question here from Brooke Crowley, who says, this is a series of questions for Brenda. I was really interested to learn how engaged the museum has been in various communities, like in attending events, community council meetings, etc. Who does that legwork? Is there a particular person who is the liaison for CMC? For example, is this part of someone's job description? Or is this shared across multiple people? How long does the museum typically engage with a community to learn what their needs and desires are? A month, a year, a decade? And lastly, do you have metrics in place for measuring the success of the eventual exhibits and/or programming?
Yeah, so actually, I think Brian could probably speak much better to this because he happens to know the person who does this for their job. But we do have a person in our education team. Our education team is a threefold effort, and one of them is community relations and community engagement. And then they have a team of people working under them in order to go out and be engaged with the communities that we have targeted to serve. That person and that team have actually been engaged with these communities on the order of years. And that engagement is not at any point meant, as far as I understand, to stop at any point. And so they become active participants in the community and community development so that they could better understand the needs that CMC can provide to learning opportunities for their community members. I think much like what Brian was saying, I don't have the knowledge to know if they have metrics in place, other than hopefully we would see more people from those communities entering our museum once they feel they've been heard, and also, of course, engaging more with us as a measure of success. Brian, would you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so the person she's referring to is my wife. So Claire Pollock, the Senior Director of Community Engagement at Cincinnati Museum Center. So there are 3 neighborhoods that we sort of targeted as historically underserved neighborhoods by the museum. And 2 of them are sort of our immediate neighbors. So we are very close to the West End in Cincinnati, and we sort of consider them our neighborhood. So Claire goes to the community council meetings. She's actually on the board of an art gallery in the West End, and sort of is really engaged with that community and their interests in the museum. And then we also work with Price Hill and Madisonville. So those are sort of underserved by the museum audiences that we sort of consider our neighbors. And so we have people that attend events in those locations, lots of festivals, community council meetings, things like that. And have been doing this for probably close to 4 years. That I've been pretty deeply engaged with these communities. There's been some really good outcomes for that. So we have, this is like probably a little bit more on the history side of the museum than on the natural history and science side. But we've had community partners who have been able to help contribute. Museum collections are, if we look at, say, maybe photo and video collections, pretty devoid of diversity. So we were able to make good connections and have people share maybe some home video that we had never seen before, and was not part of our collection, despite the fact that we've been collecting home video for a while. So this was a really good example of community outreach that I think has worked really well. And again, it's been years long effort that we've been engaged with them, these communities.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. So here's a question for Rae Ostman from Angela Potocznik. Angela says, I was really interested in your description of sharing activities with a range of museums as part of one of your projects. I'm curious to hear more about the practical side of this. How does a group develop relationships with lots of museums? Or what networks are useful here? Does this relate to the NISNet? And is there anything you can say about the academic side of how we can be useful to collaborators based in museums?
Sure. So I'm always happy to talk about museums and the NISNet. So just quickly, though, my background actually have spent more of my career working in museums and working with the NISNet than I have at ASU or in a university context. So I kind of want to be clear about that, because it's sort of like that work grew out of being part of museums more than bridging from a university. So I don't know that I'm the world's greatest expert on bridging from a university necessarily. But to talk a little bit about how NYSNet developed, because I do think there's like some interesting pieces in there that could come from that could help for other people trying to build networks. So NYSNet was originally the Nanoscale Informal Science Education Network. I think Brian probably remembers that because you're one of our partner, like original partners of NYSNet. And so it was funded by the National Science Foundation, and there was a goal to engage the public in learning about nanoscale science, engineering, and technology. There was a goal to build a network, and then there was a goal to sort of build capacity and learning about kind of engaging the public in emerging technologies. And what we like to say is we spent the first 5 years building the network, and then we spent the next 5 years kind of leveraging the network. And thinking back to the early days, there was like a small group of a kind of a core group that was involved, and we had what we called the 6 Friends strategy. And Brian, you guys may have been one of the original 6 Friends, I don't know, but it literally was like, we need to build relationships and we need to get people on board and get them excited to do this work with us, right? It's not for them. It's like, we're building a community to all do this work together. So we all had to think of like 6 friends that we could probably rope into this project with us. So our original goal was to get 100 friends total, right? So it's like a Ponzi scheme. Everybody gets 6 friends and they'll get like 6 more. But honestly, networks are about relationships, and they're about doing work that everybody values because you're doing it. We had oodles of money from National Science Foundation. So I'm not going to say just out of the goodness of our heart, but the fact that the network has continued beyond that initial funding is because the people who are involved found value in it and enjoyed working together and enjoyed kind of sharing it. So I can recommend the 6 Friends model. But there is I can put in the chat in a second, there's a volume that Larry Bell, who is the original PI of that nanoscale project, wrote about like the whole process of building the network. In terms of now that I'm in a university setting and kind of how do I try to reach out to museums, I think these kinds of collaboration skills are the same kinds of collaboration skills, honestly, you would have with any other person that you want to work with, which is you respect them, you recognize that they have expertise and capacities you don't have, you recognize that they also have the same constraints like time and money that you have, right? And so you sort of really understand that. And what you're looking for is something that you can do together better than either one of you could do alone. And I will say that really understanding that doing this work well, informal science education, doing it well, does take time, money, and expertise, and kind of really coming from a little bit of humbleness about that, I think is helpful. And I try to really be sure that I reflect that, I recognize that.
Excellent. Thank you. And Melissa Jakart, the workshop organizer, just reminded me that in the very next session, we'll be showing some of the great work that Ray has done with the NYSNet, giving folks an opportunity to check out that work. They're hands-on. You can have a hands-on look at some of the activities developed by the NYSNet in the next session. So in the last few minutes that we have, I'd like to read this question from Kristen Urasek that was originally posed to Brenda in the Slack channel, but I invite any or all of you to weigh in on it. Kristen says to Brenda, "You talked a lot about STEM identities in your presentation and frequently used rugged white males in paleontology as the media darling prototype for what we often think about when we hear the word paleontologist. Offhand, are there any subspecialties in STEM that you know of that tend to have a more inclusive prototype that comes to mind when people first think of that field? If so, are there any aha insights for why that field might appear to be doing a better job along those lines, and ways we might be able to use that knowledge to help other fields that don't fare so well in terms of inclusive prototypes?"
I have to say, honestly, without thought, more thought, not off the top of my head as much. I mean, I think I can think of other I'd like to open it up to the group to see if anybody else has any direct thoughts on that in terms of being, I think paleontology is now pretty inclusive because it has a lot of play in terms of a lot of attention, a lot of focus in, media, social media and so forth. But I don't actually have a really great answer for that off the top of my head, to be honest. Please jump in if anybody has better thoughts than I at the moment, and I'll think about it.
I was wondering if maybe primatology might be.
That's what I was just thinking too, Lucas. Jane Goodall really being kind of the face of that.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think biology is certainly better represented than say like physics, for instance, which is my degrees in physics, and it was not a lot of women in physics then, still not a ton of women in physics now, but biology seems to be pretty well represented in all kinds of diversity, actually. And I think in the general public, that seems to be a little bit more common to think of that. Maybe depends on which specialty within biology, but.
And I think it's interesting. I think it also changes geographically. I mean, I remember learning very quickly that most female paleontologists, when I would go to my international meetings, were Eastern European. And that in Eastern Europe, paleontology is considered a woman's job and not a man's job. And so even within geographic and cultural differences, the inclusivity, and that's actually in some ways as uninclusive, just in the other direction, in terms of cultural differences of how we view these roles in society and who should play them.
So I wonder then if there's been development over time, as Brian was suggesting in biology, perhaps. I mean, what are the lessons about how to make all domains of science seem more inclusive from the perspective of school kids or whatever, people who are looking up for role models in each of these areas?
I think it's important, just coming from my experience, that people see themselves in these various avenues. And that's why I think, STEM education is also a diversity initiative. I think it's really important that where we can, we provide these opportunities for people to see themselves in these settings doing this work, and increasing our diversities within them helps to also, bring more of that, I believe, into the fold. So, and some of the ways that we try to do that is to bring in different ways of knowing and different narratives into talking about science, not just from a Western perspective, but also from, Native people's perspective, different cultures and how they know, and also using different forms of ways to do that, whether it be through an artistic viewpoint or a experiential viewpoint, as opposed to just a research paper viewpoint, and helping to maybe make those relationships and those connections so that people can see themselves a bit more and cultivate that STEM identity.
And then the other big piece of work, I totally agree with all that. Then the other piece of work, though, is the culture of STEM itself, right? And not just seeming attainable or inclusive, but being inclusive and feeling like a place that you're welcome and that you want to spend your life. And that, we really can't underestimate the importance of that too. So, I mean, that's really huge.
Excellent. Thank you all. With that, we are just over time here. So I want to remind everyone that the next session starts at 12:45, and this is the Informal Science Education activity. But I want to take this opportunity to thank our three panelists. This has been a really interesting and informative discussion, so thank you very much. And we will see everybody in the next session.
Thanks for having us,
everyone. This was super fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate your great questions and love hearing from you, Brenda and Brian.
Yes, take care, everybody.